Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Ensure Government Exclusion and Anti-Kickback Controls in the New Era of CoPay Assistance. This webinar is sponsored by TrialCard. TrialCard Incorporated provides patient affordability, medication access and adherence, patient support, and clinical trial services on behalf of pharmaceutical manufacturers. Founded in 2000, TrialCard has connected nearly 33 million patients with over $15 billion in branded drug savings to date. The company is headquartered in Morrisville, North Carolina. I'm Sean Edwards from World Congress. I'll be introducing today's webinar. Just a couple of quick announcements before we start. I'd like to explain how we're handling questions. Due to the number of attendees, participant lines are muted. However, if you'd like to submit a question for our speaker, please do so using the Q&A feature that you see at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer all questions that we have time to address during our session today. Also, please note the webinar will be recorded. You'll receive an email with a link to the video so that you can view it again. I'd now like to introduce our speaker for today. Jason Zemcik is the Vice President and Patient Affordability Practice Lead at TrialCard. We're pleased to have him here. Jason, welcome. Thanks for being here. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to you.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for joining today. Thank you, as always, to our partners at World Congress. We certainly appreciate the opportunity. And certainly a topic that is not new to copay assistance, but has gone through quite a few evolutions. And as we look forward to where it may be headed, a number of important considerations that pharmaceutical manufacturers need to be aware of as they design their copay programs into the future. So a lot of things to talk about today. So we certainly appreciate everyone taking the time to join. I hope this will be helpful, educational, and informative. I'll go ahead and outline the agenda, a lot of things that we can discuss today. I'll start off by talking a little bit about the overall risk landscape that manufacturer assistance programs face. This is one of just a number of factors that can impact the integrity of a copay assistance program, but also some intersecting developments and things where this comes into play with other factors that are facing programs. And so we'll talk a little bit about how those things interjoin and how they can be jointly addressed. We'll go into some basic background on the anti-kickback statute, something that a lot may be familiar with, but for those that are newer to this topic, we can give kind of some preparatory material, and also touch on OIG guidance around coupon programs and some of the reports and studies that have been done. And then we'll get into an overview of the different government-sponsored insurance programs that have an impact on manufacturer assistance programs, and start talking about the various challenges and control mechanisms that are available to address those, and then get really specific into how to operationally apply some of those control measures to the end of ensuring that your copay program is appropriately safeguarded. We'll look a little bit at recent news and some developments that have gone on in this space, as well as some forward-looking considerations, and end up with some discussion around manufacturer best practices and key lessons learned that we've seen across our portfolio of copay assistance programs. We will leave some time at the end for questions. So hopefully it's going to be an eventful and very informative and helpful hour for everyone. So with that, we'll get right into it. So as I mentioned earlier, manufacturer copay assistance programs, they do face a number of risks or threats, if you will, to the integrity of the program. Now, this one in particular, anti-kickback compliance, it falls largely into the government and legal realm, but where it becomes even more complicated, or where it becomes a little complex, is when you look at the market and payer bucket, because specifically you're dealing with an issue where one of the core foundational challenges is that there is not a universal database or a one single source information repository of government-sponsored insurance plans, which makes it even more difficult for pharmaceutical manufacturers to design controls that appropriately safeguard their program, since you have to combine a number of different data points and really layer in a number of different measures to safeguard your program given that. Some brief background on the anti-kickback statute. Again, many may very well be familiar with it. Came into play in the 1970s, 1972, I believe, and essentially what it says in relation to manufacturer copay assistance programs, or where it is relevant and how it applies, is that it prohibits the willful offer of payment to induce the purchase of any item or service that could be paid for by a federal healthcare program. We have the link to the entire anti-kickback statute down there at the bottom of the slide. But where this also becomes interesting is that it defines a federal healthcare program as also including state healthcare programs. So you go beyond just simply Medicare and into state Medicaid programs, and we'll also talk about some others there that are applied. And one other interesting point on this is that the law states that actual knowledge or specific intent is not required to constitute an anti-kickback violation. And this becomes incredibly important from the pharmaceutical manufacturer standpoint when you're designing your program, because it, again, is another consideration you need to take into account, in that there does not have to be a deliberate intent to induce or specific knowledge that it's occurring. So when you look at it from a program integrity standpoint, planning controls for your program, being able to err on the side of caution and ensure that your program is adequately safeguarded. So moving on, the Office of the Inspector General issued some specific guidance on this topic as it relates to manufacturer coupon programs in 2014. I think a lot that have signed up for this webinar may be familiar with these two items. There was a report and then also a special advisory bulletin. And some of the key factors, which we have links to both of them below there so that you can go out and reference. Some of the key items that are included in each of these are that middle bullet is where we tend to focus a lot, and especially our organization as a CoPay program provider working on behalf of pharmaceutical manufacturers, is that the government places the responsibility for compliance with the anti-kickback statute on pharmaceutical manufacturers. So despite some of the challenges that we alluded to earlier, and that we'll get into deeper, specifically around lack of a single source database, the pharmaceutical manufacturer bears that responsibility for operating their program in a compliant manner and not inducing government insured beneficiaries. As you see there at the very bottom bullet there, it specifically references, regardless of future actions by CMS, the offerers of coupon programs ultimately bear responsibility. So that's a very key theme, and something that you'll see throughout this discussion is the onus being on the pharmaceutical manufacturer to be compliant. Here's a quick overview of government-sponsored insurance programs that are impacted here. So I think everyone's well familiar with Medicare. You're probably very well familiar with Medicaid as well. TRICARE for active duty military service members, as well as retirees, National Guard members, children, former spouses, a number of other categories. When you think of TRICARE, think of the Armed Services, and then the Department of Veterans Affairs. Now, some of the other ones that may not get as much attention, but that we include in here are CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, as well as Indian Health Services. And we can see out in the far right side there, we have brief descriptions of each of those. So when you are considering your anti-kickback controls for your program, these are all the different areas that you want to think of and have controls in place and able to identify patients that are beneficiaries in these programs so that you're not offering copay assistance to them. So we talked earlier about challenges that this causes, and so we'll get deeper into each of those. And when we think of this issue, we try to bucket those challenges into different areas. And so hopefully this slide does a good job of that. You look at challenges that arise from patients, either actions that patients will take or actions that patients may not take, whether that's through willful intent or just simply unintentional, unknowingly. And then you get into pharmacy, risks at the pharmacy, actions by the pharmacy, as well as health plans. There's a brief element of health plans in there, primarily around what we talked about earlier, the fact that in many cases, it's not entirely distinguishable if a plan is government sponsored or not. So one of the things, I touched on it already, I'll mention it again, the biggest issue, lack of a universal database of government sponsored health plan information. This issue would be very much easier if there was one single source of information. I think a lot will probably recognize right away. That's somewhat of a common theme throughout our industry, the fact that information and data resides in multiple different sources. So then the offerers of these types of programs, support programs, patient assistance programs, really have to be deliberate in integrating all of those data sources, or as many data sources as they are able to come up with that full picture and be as compliant as you can. The second bullet speaks specifically to what I mentioned about patients. The patient may not fully understand the exclusion criteria. They may not understand it all, to be quite frank. I think from a patient standpoint, there's obviously that natural inclination to simply seek out whatever discount mechanism is available. You get a prescription, you're going to immediately go online and search for discounts. And if you're a Medicare patient, you're a government insured beneficiary, you're simply going to see that there is a manufacturer-sponsored copay assistance offer out there. You may not understand that you're not eligible for that due to your status as being part of a government-sponsored insurance program. So patients may still try to enroll in and use these programs. And that's where when you get into the program design element with the manufacturer in conjunction with your copay program provider, you really have to account for that, understanding that patients may still try to access and use these programs. Another risk area on the patient side is simply if the patient recently transitioned away from commercial insurance, but they were used to using copay assistance. So you could see this if a patient transitions. We'll talk a little bit about later the expansion of state Medicaid programs. That could be one scenario. Another one that's fairly common is when a person reaches Medicare eligibility and they transition from commercial insurance to Medicare coverage. If they've used a copay card for a number of years as part of their prescription, or even just very recently, there may again be that attempt to use it despite the fact that they've become ineligible. Also, you have the element of pharmacists, and again, simply the desire to try to help patients. Now, I think most pharmacists at this point, especially since this issue has been around for a while, I think most are pretty familiar with anti-kickback rules, and specifically the understanding that government-sponsored, government-insured patients are not eligible for copay assistance. But that's not always the case. And you may have a pharmacist that just simply, they're in the business of helping patients, and they want to try to get a patient to get as much of a discount as they can. And so there could be attempts to still process a copay offer for a government-insured patient. So this brings us to our first polling question. We always like to get this type of feedback from our audience just to see how you're assessing this. So what we'd like to understand more about is, what do you specifically feel is the most challenging element of anti-kickback compliance for copay assistance? So if you choose one, we talked obviously about the lack of the universal source of government-sponsored health plan information, the limited ability to identify and action on indicators of government-sponsored insurance in real time. And we'll get into this a little bit further as the presentation goes on, and the critical need to be able to do that quickly. And then finally, the uncertainty around how the OIG monitors and enforces compliance on this topic. All right, it looks like we have some results here. Let's see, so the most answered was number 2, limited ability to identify and action on indicators of government-sponsored insurance in real time. That is that's not surprising because that is, when you get down to the crux of this issue, it is having that real-time ability to identify and prevent claims from occurring. So that is certainly not surprising. Coming in second was the lack of a universal information source. Again, that's kind of one of the foundational challenge around this topic. And third, at 17%, was uncertainty around how the OIG monitors and enforces compliance. So thank you everyone for answering, and those are some very, very interesting, albeit not surprising, responses. And we'll dig in deeper to each of those as we continue here. So getting into control measures, we talk often when we work with our pharmaceutical manufacturer clients in designing their copay programs around the need to layer controls throughout a patient's interaction with the program. And what do I mean by that is having mechanisms at multiple points throughout someone's involvement with a copay program, so that you aren't just simply relying on one specific area of the program that is the only way that you can prevent a patient that may potentially be government insured from using the program. So If you take a look at the graphic here, you'll see the arrows get increasingly darker. And so trying to illustrate more intensity as a patient progresses throughout the stages of interacting with a program. So obviously, those of you familiar with CoPay programs, you have an upfront portion, you have an enrollment where the patient initially enters the program and gains access. You have the interaction, you have the activity at the pharmacy, or in the case of a medical benefit covered product and a copay assistance program for a provider administered therapy at the provider office. So we call that, the pharmacy or the site of dispense, site of administration. And then finally, at the point of claim adjudication, when the claim is actually processed and payment issued. So those are all the areas where we discuss how you can control this and how you can put mechanisms in place to ensure compliance. When you think of enrollment controls upfront, and even provider and pharmacist controls, these are what I like to refer to as deterrents because they can be effective. They can prevent some elements of non-compliance, but they're limited in what they are able to do. And the reason for that is, as you look at the second bullet, and probably everyone's aware of this, they rely upon a person understanding and doing the right thing. So I talked earlier about how a patient, they may be government insured, but they may still try to gain access to a copay assistance program. It may be a scenario where they don't fully understand what the regulations are, what the legal implications are, and just again, as a patient, as a consumer of healthcare, it's not uncommon to have a mindset of, well, just try it and see if it works. So you could have that. Or you could have someone who, despite they make a well-intentioned effort, they read the terms and conditions and they just simply don't understand the fact that they should self-attest out or they should opt out of the program. I think there's been other presentations. One of the ones I think of recently is there was a drug channels webinar, not this most recent one, but the last quarter, where there's some very interesting stats around how such a small percentage of Americans understand different terms of the mechanics of healthcare and different terms of healthcare coverage. So it's not unreasonable to think that someone could read the terms and conditions of a copay program and unknowingly still try to enter despite the fact that they were ineligible. And so where that leads us is when you get to the end, you really do, despite having controls in other areas, you do have to have very strong data-driven claim controls to be able to prevent and demonstrate when you think about from an audit standpoint or reporting standpoint, be able to demonstrate that you have systems in place that are able to action in real time and are driven by data and aren't solely reliant upon a person self-attesting properly or a pharmacist refusing to process a claim or understanding that a patient is not eligible. So let's go a little deeper into the types of controls and the purpose that each serves. And I think this visual can be helpful to really think of these anti-kickback controls around copay assistance in two separate buckets. So on the left, you have your enrollment controls, and the purpose of those is to prevent ineligible patients from accessing your program to begin with. Your adjudication controls on the right-hand side are to prevent claims that have indicators of potential government-sponsored insurance. So really you're looking at both a sort of a two-pronged effort here. One, you want to keep as many patients out of the program that are not eligible to begin with, but understanding that depending on, and part of this gets into how you design your program and how you design your enrollment step, understanding that that's not the only way to address this issue. You want to have elements in place that prevent claims from being processed if a patient turns out to be government insured. So when you look at enrollment controls, obviously, I think everyone's very familiar with terms and conditions. If you work around copay programs, you see there's fairly standard language on most that say patients, if you are insured by Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, VA, any government-sponsored insurance program, you are not eligible for this. Most of these programs have a question up front where the patient must answer a question, a self-attestation question. One thing that you can do to kind of enhance or strengthen this is capture additional information at the point of enrollment and conduct screening. Now, this is a topic that could be really its own session in itself because it gets fairly complicated in terms of the data capture and the data exchange. And there's generally some element of external services, electronic services that are occurring at that point. But really, the overarching concept is that you require the patient to provide some form of additional information, whether it's demographic information about themselves and or insurance plan information. And that is screened up front to make a determination of whether the patient is allowed to enter the program or not. Again, some programs do that. Some do not, and I think each, there's pros and cons to each design. Different pharmaceutical manufacturers have different reasons for choosing to incorporate that or not, but that's a way that you can strengthen your enrollment step, again, to the end of keeping as many patients out of the program that you don't want in it to begin with. When you move over to the right-hand side and you get to the adjudication controls, so again, we talk about the terms and conditions language. They're likely going to have instructions to the pharmacist, to the healthcare provider. I think most in the healthcare profession, as I said, they probably understand that. But in the event that it's not top of mind to them or readily familiar, there's very standard language basically saying the same thing and instructing the pharmacist not to process claims for patients that are government insured. When you think about medical benefit programs, and if there's claim submissions that involve explanation of benefits or other documents that are submitted, this could also bring into play visual inspection of claim documents to be able to determine, is a patient a government insured beneficiary, part of a government sponsored healthcare program. But down in the bottom right-hand corner, again, where this ultimately ends up at is at your business rule processing logic for your claims, for electronic claim processing, having the business rule criteria in place to identify data elements of the claim that are indicators of potential government-sponsored insurance and to deny those claims from successfully processing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think the main takeaway from this, if you see in the very bottom section there, is that proper and effective CoPay program design is going to combine elements of both enrollment and claim level claim processing controls in order to maximize your safeguards. So this slide offers a little bit of detail around where exactly claim level controls would come into play in the CoPay program claim adjudication process. So what it does is helpful to show, I highlighted in blue there, step 5. If you follow this through step by step, it essentially shows how a patient interacts with CoPay assistance, everything from initially presenting to the pharmacy their insurance information and their CoPay offer, the pharmacy, of course, billing the patient's primary insurance, and then the insurance returning coverage determination, what the patient's remaining out-of-pocket responsibility is, and then the pharmacy billing the CoPay program as a secondary payer, which is at the point where the business rule logic and the claim level anti-kickback controls would come into play. So analyzing in real time that claim submission, looking at different data elements of the claim, and if it meets the criteria of potentially government insured, and I say that potentially government insured deliberately and specifically, in that a lot of manufacturers we work with, they want to approach this topic from a standpoint of err on the side of caution. So we can talk a little bit about different items that by themselves may not be indicators of government-sponsored insurance, but could be, and being able to build your controls in a way that you initially do not allow that claim to go through, but there is some option to make a deeper evaluation, a secondary evaluation, where if it is determined that the patient is not government insured and they would be eligible for CoPay assistance, that claim could still be adjudicated. As we see there, if the claim passes government insurance checks, it's ultimately paid and it continues on through the CoPay assistance, the standard claim process. But hopefully this is just a helpful visual of understanding where in the process this all occurs. One of the most common questions we get asked, and understandably so, and especially when we're describing these types of controls to a legal or a compliance audience, wanting to be sure that they're comfortable with the provider that their organization is choosing to operate their CoPay program, is being able to see it and where it exists within the CoPay assistance process. So this goes into specific areas that can be screened. We talked earlier about patient information. So at the point of enrollment, the patient providing some very basic information, or if the manufacturer so chooses, more detailed information. So things such as demographic information about the person or their health plan. We have many CoPay programs where you'll see the manufacturer will require the patient to enter in their insurance information. And we'll talk about how that can be used and how it can't be used and should not be used. And there's even some government guidelines around that. But that's kind of a deeper level of enrollment control, is doing that additional eligibility screening up front. And then also claim information, which we just talked about, looking at in real time as the claim is being adjudicated. I think there's 100 and I can't remember how many fields are on a standard pharmacy claim, but there are several of those that either stand alone by themselves or when combined with other elements of information could indicate that the patient is government insured, and being able to, in real time, deny and reject claims that meet certain criteria. So this slide shows what I mentioned earlier, and perhaps I should have ordered them differently, but nonetheless, this kind of gives a good example here. Again, many may be very, very well familiar with this. Others, it may be new information, but you see the box in red there. This is pretty standard terms and conditions or eligibility screening language when a patient goes to enroll in a CoPay program. This is taken obviously from a web enrollment, which is pretty standard in today's era of CoPay assistance. But this could also be done when if you have a program that has enrollment occurring through alternate mechanisms, IVR, live agent. If it's part of a broader patient support program, hub services program, the patient will be asked if they are a government insured beneficiary. You see down at the bottom there, the box I've outlined in black. This is your terms and conditions language, which every CoPay program is going to have some very similar variation of this type of language. The fact that patient in any of these government sponsored programs is not eligible. So we talked earlier about enrollment screening, and specifically taking information that the patient provides and using that to arrive at an eligibility determination. And I think this is an important part, and I added this to the presentation because I think it's important to make the distinction between different types of activities that can occur in this realm and what is and what isn't appropriate. So if you see here, and I referenced the report and I linked it here when these slides become available, a few years back, CMS and the pharmacy industry collaborated with the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs to develop the E1 eligibility transaction. This is for Medicare Part D screening. And its purpose is to determine if a patient is covered under Medicare Part D to bill for prescriptions that are reimbursable by Medicare Part D. And so its intended use, as you see there in the second sub-bullet, is for pharmacies, physicians' offices, clinics, other entities that dispense prescription drugs and would be billing Medicare Part D for a patient's prescription. This is not, as I mentioned down at the bottom, not an appropriate, under the CMS guidelines, not an appropriate eligibility screening tool for other purposes. They reference, if you read through this report, they reference marketing, evaluating marketing leads. They reference, other areas, and the root reason why they don't want this being used for things other than specifically determining a patient's eligibility for an entity to bill for is because it does expose PHI. When you read through it, it'll outline all the different inputs, patient information inputs that go into it, and what's returned. And so it's very important to understand in the CoPay space that an E1 transaction should not be part of your eligibility screening criteria. I think we've probably heard there's some instances where there's organizations that, and they reference some in the report, organizations inappropriately using this. I forget the exact numbers, but they cite them in the report, around the hundreds of thousands of E1 transactions that they evaluated, audited, and found that a significant portion of them were being used inappropriately. So when you're looking at designing your program, and if you go a little further and you say, we want to add additional eligibility screening criteria, specifically around patient information, capturing information from the patient and using that to make an eligibility determination. It's important to ensure that that your provider you're working with, whatever organization you're working with, that there's not misuse of E1 transactions. Now, there is ability to use a variety of different electronic services. And I think, again, many may be familiar. There's a number in the market, a number of providers that work in this space that provide real-time information and return information based on patient inputs. So the key factor to remember here is that those transactions, those events, are not rendering a determination. What they're doing is supplying additional information so that a determination can be made. And I think that's important because with an E1 transaction, it's going to return whether a patient is Medicare Part D eligible or not. So of course, if you're thinking from the standpoint of a copay program, you'd be looking for the inverse. If they were Part D eligible, you would not allow them enrollment into your copay program. But the use of other e-services would simply allow you to capture additional information about the patient's health plan or about the patient themselves to be able to make that determination, as opposed to receiving a yes or no, a binary eligibility determination back from any of those transactions. So a very important part to consider, to keep in mind as you work through your copay program design. So this takes us to polling question 2. Sean, I apologize. I think at the beginning, we typically let you read these and I just kind of jumped right into it. So we are here at question 2 and I'll let you take it away, Sean.
Okay. What types of anti-kickback controls are incorporated in the copay programs you work on or have worked on? Patient self-attestation, a program enrollment, patient or insurance information capture and eligibility screening, a program enrollment, real-time electronic claim evaluation logic, claim QA/QC, and auditing. We'll give people about 30 seconds or so to answer.
All right, so I see we have some responses in here. The most answered was patient or insurance information capture and eligibility screening. We are certainly seeing more and more of this. And I think, it's driven by several things. And I think for especially a lot of specialty therapies that have additional services or that for which copay assistance is part of a broader suite of patient support services, a broader patient support program. At the enrollment step, there's going to be more than just a simple, patient goes onto a website, goes onto a portal, or the provider or the SP goes to a portal and signs the patient up. So this is not surprising. And I think that the copay assistance landscape is indeed trending more in this direction to have more detailed enrollment screening. Second is patient self-attestation of program enrollment. Again, not surprising. That's the core kind of foundational element of copay assistance enrollment. So 31% indicated that. Real-time electronic claim evaluation logic. That is something we'll talk a little bit more, but that is really, as I said, when you get down to it, that's an element of control that you certainly want to consider having in place on your pharmacy claims to be able to demonstrate that you can identify as the claim is being processed, whether a patient is part of a government-sponsored program, and if so, reject that claim so that it does not go through. And then finally, claim, QA, QC, and auditing. We'll talk a little bit about that because similar to any process, any mechanism, any control, you want to make sure that you have appropriate follow-up. And this really covers everything from escalation paths within your organization. If there is a situation where you feel rule criteria may not have been appropriately applied or something just does not function the way it is intended, being able to quickly identify those, route them for action and resolution, and then from a broader standpoint, on a periodic cadence, go back and look at the performance of your control measures. So it's definitely important to have a QA, QC, and audit process in place. And I'll talk a little bit, I won't go into full details because we want to stay on track with the educational element of the session. But our organization in particular, we'll get client audited, of course. So the pharmaceutical manufacturers we work with will conduct audits of us on this topic, whether it's their internal audit group, or oftentimes we'll see some of the third-party audit firms, and a lot that everyone is probably familiar with, will come in and take a sample of, take a data set and conduct an audit. But also self-commissioning audits. We will get an independent third-party audit, again, where we'll have a external entity come in, take a data set, examine it, produce a report of findings. And so, again, just being able to show the holistic end-to-end, having controls at every point in the patient's interaction with the program, but then also the follow-up or the follow-through feedback loop of QA, QC, and auditing. So recent developments in this area, and I should title this very recent developments because it was last Friday. As I was preparing for this presentation, I actually intended to talk about this topic from the standpoint of what if, or what could the implications be for the future of copay assistance. If many of you well know, Pfizer, they brought a lawsuit against the government requesting to be able to provide copay assistance to Medicare beneficiaries for a particular product on the basis that it was, or it is, the only approved product on market to treat a specific condition. And therefore, by offering copay assistance, their argument was that it did not constitute inducement because there was no alternative therapy that the patient could otherwise consider. They were not successful in that. So if you see the news release, I'm sure many read this in the news. On Friday, the court ruled against Pfizer on two separate points. One was standard copay assistance that we're familiar with, but the other, and this is an area of anti-kickback that again could constitute its own presentation. And those of you that attend a lot of the industry seminars and events in this area, you'll see that it often does, is anti-kickback violations, anti-kickback statute violations with regard to charitable foundation support. When you think about manufacturers standing up foundations and making financial contributions to foundations that are arranged for a particular disease state, being able to support patients in that way. So a very recent development on this is the result of this litigation. As we think ahead, though, and it remains to be seen whether another pharmaceutical manufacturer may try a similar approach on this topic. And if that were to come to fruition, it would really create another layer of complication around this topic, in that you could have different degrees of government exclusion, anti-kickback controls necessary within your program. As I said, if the conditions were, if it were based on a product status as the only available therapy on market, your standard government exclusion anti-kickback controls would not apply to that product, but would apply to the copay program for another product. So for the moment, this won't change how government exclusion and anti-kickback compliance is managed, but it's something that I think is certainly worth being mindful of, being aware of, and just thinking through, obviously us as a provider of copay programs, we've kind of done some operational planning around all the what if scenarios, if anything like this were to occur. But from a manufacturer standpoint, just spending kind of that time as you think about what could be the future of anti-kickback if something like this were to materialize down the road. So forthcoming considerations. This, I will admit, this is a very busy slide, but there's a few things that are kind of on the table that could impact this topic in the future. And so we'll go through each of them, kind of understand how they all apply, how they could impact copay assistance. And again, all of it rooted in what you need to be thinking of as a pharmaceutical manufacturer, or if you're a consultant working with a manufacturer on setting up their program and ensuring it's compliant. So the first, if you look at the Kaiser Family Foundation article that I have there in the upper left, there has been talk for a while, and it remains to be seen if it will ultimately come to fruition, but talk about lowering, from a policy standpoint, lowering the eligibility age for Medicare. I believe the recent proposal that was talked about during the election cycle and has been batted around in government is lowering the age from 65 down to 60. So if this were to occur, obviously it would create another entire crop of patients who now were once eligible for commercial copay assistance that would transition over to Medicare and become ineligible. Now, obviously, if this does occur, not every person that's of that age, of eligibility age, is going to be enrolled in Medicare, which this is an important thing that even in present day, when we deal with age 65 and older eligibility, not every person that's of Medicare age is Medicare, is enrolled in Medicare. There are people that are still commercially insured. And so something to be aware of, but you're simply moving the goal line, so to speak, moving it further forward. And therefore you're having more patients that should not gain entry to your program. But I think where it becomes particularly impactful is in the fact that you're going to have a lot of patients, especially in the immediate term, if something like this were to come to pass. Again, how we talked about earlier, patients that were very used to using copay assistance and all of a sudden are not eligible. So there's likely going to be continued attempts to use their copay offer where they may not understand why they've all of a sudden not become eligible. A similar topic is Medicaid expansion. So you see down there the other article or the other map, which is tied to an article we have linked there at the bottom of the slide. A number of states have passed Medicaid expansion, and there are several others, I believe it's either 10 or 11 that have not adopted it. But I think COVID has really accelerated the interest or the push around this. So again, patients going from once previously eligible for copay assistance to now no longer eligible. So understanding that within your program, realizing that you're going to have more attempts that you need to be able to appropriately identify and reject. So looking at your controls from an enrollment standpoint and also a claim processing standpoint, because again, when you think of patients and familiarity with their pharmacy and vice versa, their pharmacy's familiarity with them, if for a considerable amount of time, the pharmacy was used to processing claims for that patient and applying a copay offer, now all of a sudden that patient is not eligible. It's going to result in there will be attempts, even if they're not ill-intentioned, and you have to have that ability to identify and reject that and prevent that. And then finally, the big one, and this really touches on a number of different aspects of program design, and we've done other presentations on this. There's a lot of talk about it in the industry, but it's the forthcoming CMS Final Rule around Medicaid best price and the specific impact to manufacturer coupon programs, or that manufacturer coupon programs will have. To do a brief synopsis of it, effective in 2023, in cases where a manufacturer coupon is not, the value of it is not credited entirely to the patient in terms of meeting their cost sharing obligation, the pharmaceutical manufacturer would be required to report that as part of their Medicaid best price, factor that in as a discount price concession, no different than any other commercial rebates or price concessions. So what that has pretty much everyone in the industry, scratching their head over and actively working on trying to figure out the best way to address is how do pharmaceutical manufacturers deliver the benefit of their copay assistance program, of their cost sharing assistance, in a way that can shield it from this best price obligation, or that can avoid additional best price obligation. And I pulled out the specific language in the final rule there. So you see I have the snippet of the Federal Register filing there. And then I zoomed in on something in particular that I think is going to cause a lot of, not necessarily challenge, but certainly worthy of a lot of thought and a lot of detail when going through the design process with manufacturers and their coupon program providers, is that CMS mentions, and this isn't the only answer to this, but it is certainly one answer that I think we'll see a lot of, changing the structure of manufacturer-sponsored assistance programs so that the patients pay for the drug first, and then they submit a receipt to the copay program to get reimbursed for the amount they paid out of pocket. Now, outside of the realm and scope of this discussion, we can talk about how that does work for some patients, and based on the financial outlay, it may not work for all patients. And that's a consideration that every manufacturer is contending with. But for the patients for whom that will work and that are able to participate in that, what you have to think about is it addresses one problem around best price and accumulators, but you have to be very careful to not create another problem for yourself and for your program, in that you are losing your government exclusion, your anti-kickback controls by virtue of taking the pharmacy claim out of it. So it's kind of a catch-22 for the pharmaceutical manufacturer in that the copay claim, the pharmacy claim, is what provides the data, makes the data available. It creates a record that a manufacturer coupon was used, and that's what gets reported to PBMs and how health plans operate accumulator adjustments. So you remove that from the equation and you solve the issue around accumulators, but then you have to think about how do you have the government exclusion controls and the real-time claim adjudication logic necessary to be able to ensure ultimate or optimal compliance with this, and that you're not sacrificing anti-kickback compliance in the name of shielding yourself from best price impact. So as you move forward, and I think many on this webinar are probably actively involved with their copay program provider in designing different scenarios, different steps in this process around how do we adjust our program to be compliant with this final rule on best price in 2023. It's very important to keep in mind that you need to still maintain and ensure government exclusion anti-kickback controls are in place. You don't completely sacrifice those. So that's something that as we move forward, and kind of why we titled the webinar, The New Era of Copay Assistance, I think it's very realistic to think that the majority of copay program claims could very well shift to a different reimbursement model once this rule goes into effect. Now, fully understanding there is a lawsuit currently against CMS, Pharma filed a lawsuit, and how that plays out remains to be seen. I think everyone in the industry would breathe a sigh of relief if it were to be successful, or even if the rule were to get delayed or modified, or there's any number of different scenarios that could occur. But keeping in mind the fact that you have to plan for this in advance, you have to have the operational timeline and backwards planning to be able to implement it to be effective in 2023 on the first of the year. And also the patient messaging, which is a very key component, making sure that patients understand how their copay program will be changing, what they're going to do differently, what the new experience is going to look like. That's something that you have to start well in advance. So you can't just expect to flip a switch on December 31st. And now every patient is just going to use the new program the way you've drawn it up. So the reason I mention all of this is because with these efforts actively going on right now, it's very important not to lose sight of anti-kickback compliance in any of these new alternate program design models, and that make use of alternate reimbursement vehicles and reimbursing the patient in ways that occur outside of the pharmacy claim. So that takes us to our third polling question. Sean, I'll let you go ahead.
What do you believe will be the most significant anti-kickback challenge regarding copay programs in the next 3 years? Expansion of government-sponsored healthcare programs, alternate reimbursement models to avoid copay accumulator and best price impact, demonstrating sufficient compliance against increased government scrutiny of manufacturer-sponsored patient assistance programs. And again, we'll give about 30 seconds.
All right. Thank you to everyone for answering. Very, very interesting always. And this was the one that I kind of had the most interest in, just because it is, as I said, top of mind to so many in the industry right now. And again, not surprising that the biggest challenge everyone sees, or that most see, is how do you maintain compliance with the increased prevalence of alternate reimbursement models. So again, something that, as we talked about, we're working with a number of our clients on this. There are definitely ways that, as I said, you want to make sure you don't solve one problem, but create another problem for yourself. So as you go through your design, ensuring that you think about, how do I still make sure that this patient is not government insured and they're coming into the copay program if we're switching to more of a rebate model, things like that. The next one, demonstrating sufficient compliance against increased government scrutiny. So that's always, I think that's always going to be a concern. As a lot of us, if you, again, as I said, you go to seminars, you go to conferences, you listen to presentations, and I especially always like to listen in on the enforcement panels and the OIG panels and the former prosecutor panels. And so much is made of federal regulatory action against manufacturers and judgments against pharmaceutical manufacturers. And a lot of it is in the foundation realm, but anti-kickback compliance, it's just the entire area has become something that manufacturers are always facing scrutiny. And similar to so many topics in our space and across all industries really, but a specific application to our space, I think the COVID conditions, COVID situation has created even more of an increased focus on this, just because healthcare fraud across the board is just, there have been more opportunities created as a result of COVID and all the different avenues that has opened up. So I absolutely can understand that being a concern in the years ahead. Expansion of government-sponsored healthcare programs got the least, and that's not surprising just because it's a what if. It's talked about. It's certainly not the first time it's been talked about. But the one key point on that is that if you have your controls in place, if you have them well designed, if you have them well maintained, if you have them monitored and ensuring that you're keeping up on them, then really the volume of claims or the volume of patients that flow through them, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it really, you can design your program, design your controls so that you can absorb additional patients that come through that and that need to be identified and not allowed access to your program. So we have a few minutes left here. I do want to leave time for some questions. So I'll quickly go through what are best practices for pharmaceutical manufacturers in this space as you work with your copay program provider. So first and foremost is knowledge leadership. Ask the questions of your provider. We always tell our clients, when we have meetings with them, and I often joke sometimes because people will apologize for asking so many questions. And I say, that's the reason we're having this session, the reason we're having this meeting. Make sure that you really spend the time getting into the details, understanding both, what the rules are, what the legislation is, understanding the operational aspect of how the controls work, what they do, what they don't do, where the potential gaps are. It's very, very important because that sets the foundation for an effective series of controls and effective compliance program. That middle point there, I made the bullet down there. Program design is what really is the root of all of this. Because if you draw your program up right from the start, draw it up well from the start, you will save yourself a lot of trouble down the road. So this covers everything from your eligibility criteria, the controls you put in place at enrollment, your program business rules, where we talked so much about the importance of that real-time claim processing logic. And then also, again, being very mindful of payment vehicles. And I say that due to the increased prevalence that we're going to see of alternate reimbursement to address accumulators and best price, and not wanting to sacrifice compliance in this area for compliance in another area. And finally, I wrap it all up with data and technology. And I know this gets talked about in every aspect of our industry, but it is really where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, on this topic. Being able to, in real time, identify, analyze elements of a claim submission, and then make a determination, have rule-driven logic that makes a determination of whether that event should be allowed to occur. And that applies the same whether it's an enrollment into the program or whether it's a claim being processed through the program and paid. So hopefully these are very helpful for those that are in the process of or in a role in which you have a responsibility for designing copay programs. So that brings us to the end. We do still have a little bit of time left. Certainly a lot to get through. I feel like I flew through everything, but I hope it was helpful for everyone. And in the few minutes we have left, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Jason. The first question, can you describe some common themes or guidance around enforcement of this topic and how pharmaceutical manufacturers can incorporate those in their program design?
Yes. So I mentioned earlier, a lot of us, you probably listened to the panels, the OIG panels and the prosecutor panels, and there's always some element of that at every industry presentation. And the biggest themes that I have noticed through those are two things, really. One is that you simply cannot have, and I think the forthcoming changes in copay program design, additional reimbursement models only serve to highlight this. You cannot have just a set it and forget it attitude around this topic. It's not simply a switch that you turn on and then you just don't have to worry about it anymore. It's something that you do have to regularly audit, you have to regularly monitor, you have to regularly make sure that your safeguards are working in the way that they need to be, and also that you're updating the information that those safeguards are triggered off of. And when you think about, health plans, and plans change every year, and certain bins can support both government and commercial plans, and all of that information, it pulls in that data and technology element, but it's something that you can't allow your solution or your controls in this area to get stale. So that's one key theme that I always like to highlight to our clients. The other is simply demonstrating that you are doing everything that you can to ensure compliance. So, if you operate from the position on this topic that there is no universal answer key, it would be a lot easier if there was just one single source and you had to run a check against it. But in the absence of that, being able to show that you have controls in enrollment, that you have mechanisms at the pharmacy counter, that you have real-time claim logic, that you are QAing and QCing your claims, that you are doing monitoring, that you're doing audits. Being able to show that holistic approach and that you are doing everything you're able to will come off much more favorably than simply, if you can only demonstrate that you put one set of controls in place, but you don't really have a whole lot of follow-up around it. So those are the two things that I would really key in on in that area.
Okay. And another question. Do you think pharma needs to tighten requirements with the advent of these cost containment programs being marketed to payers to help control SP costs, like Payer Matrix, for example?
I don't necessarily think that pharma needs to tighten controls. I think that simply they need to ensure, you maintain the fundamentals, stick to the fundamentals, and do them well. Everything that I just mentioned earlier. Make sure that you're doing all those things. Do an assessment of your entire program. And do we have all of these things in place? If you do, are you keeping up with them? Can you demonstrate that you're regularly updating them? So I don't necessarily think you need to tighten your controls unless you identify an area that you think may be missing from your program and you need to add to it, to that point of, can we show that we're doing everything in our power? I think that may be the one area. If you recognize that within your program and you think you need to tighten that up, then yes, absolutely. But otherwise, I think it's really the main idea is really just making sure that you stay on top of this topic and you continually demonstrate that you have appropriate measures in place.
Got it. Next question. I'm seeing more and more attestations from HCPs regarding patient government program exclusions. Do you think this is an additional control? Are you seeing this as well, or just patient attestations?
We are seeing that. I think manufacturers are, and that's an interesting topic, and I'm actually glad someone brought that up. So we are seeing some programs, and it is entirely a manufacturer legal, a manufacturer compliance decision, and what ultimately your comfort level is with that. But we are seeing some programs incorporate things such as an attestation, whether it be by the patient or by the HCP, that the patient is not accessing, if they are government insured, they're not accessing the product through their government insurance, for example, through their Medicare insurance. And there's a form letter that they'll use, and it says, I basically am presenting as a cash paying patient, and this won't count towards my true out of pocket. And I'm essentially disavowing my Medicare benefits, and I'm a cash patient. So we are seeing, I wouldn't necessarily say more of that. We're seeing it. And I think it's something that, again, depending on the situation of the product, depending on the manufacturer's risk tolerance and what your objectives are, it very well could be rooted in what your patient population mix is. I think that is a strategy that some manufacturers will continue to use. We haven't necessarily seen a dramatic increase in it, but it is something that we do see.
Okay. The next question, do you know the status of passage of state level legislation banning accumulators and maximizers? And do you see more states moving in this direction as the January 2023 deadline for best price change gets closer?
Good question. But happy to answer it as it is relevant in a cursory way. So to date, there are 11 states that have passed legislation prohibiting CoPay accumulators. Not all of those have taken effect yet. Some go into effect in 2022. There are several other states that have proposed legislation, and it's working its way through the legislative process. So I do think that we will, over time, see more states do that from a legislative standpoint, try to prohibit accumulator adjustments. Now, the important thing to remember on that is that those state laws generally will only apply to fully insured plans sold on the exchange. So any type of self-funded plan, employer-sponsored coverage, for example, would not be addressed by this, would not be impacted by state legislation. There's ERISA preemption. Federal law would preempt the state law. And so you're not going to simply see that we'll get to a point where all 50 states legislate away the accumulator issue. It'll certainly make a dent in it, but it's not by itself a solution. But to get to the core question, we have seen more states do that, and I think that trend will continue. I think, really the big thing is being able to show impact to a particular constituency, to be able to get at a state level legislative attention. I think really where that comes from is being able to show data and say, this is the impact that this has had to patients, this issue, in terms of how much additional out-of-pocket expense patients have had to occur as a result of accumulators, and getting from a legislative standpoint, someone to take that up and to sponsor that type of legislation. I know a number of manufacturers, and we work with their policy groups and advocacy and government affairs. They're doing a lot of work in that area. So I do think we'll see a continuation of those efforts as we approach 2023 and best price.
Okay, and we are just at the top of the hour. Jason, any final thoughts you want to impart on the audience as we wrap up?
No additional thoughts, just simply thank you to everyone for joining. Again, hope it was very helpful, informative. Feel free to reach out with any additional questions. And as always, thank you to the team at World Congress. You're wonderful to work with, and we appreciate the opportunity.
All right, well, thanks for your time as well, Jason. Thank you to TrialCard for sponsoring and making our session today possible. Just a reminder, folks, the webinar has been recorded. You'll receive an email with a link to the video so that you can view it again. And to access additional webinars or get info on how your organization can speak or sponsor, please visit wcwebed.com. Thanks again for joining us, everyone. Have a great day. And this now concludes today's discussion.